The morning sun barely peeked through the clouds as Officer Sarah Reynolds sat in her patrol car, parked behind a small coffee shop in downtown Atlanta. She sipped her third coffee of the day, her blue eyes scanning the street with what her colleagues called her hunter's gaze. 6 years on the force had made her confident, maybe too confident, in her instincts about people. The radio crackled with routine calls, but Sarah wasn't really listening. Her attention fixed on a black BMW that rolled past her position. The car wasn't speeding, but something about it made her sit up straighter. The windows were tinted, but not illegally so. The car was clean, expensive looking, and being driven perfectly within the speed limit. Sarah pulled out behind the BMW, following it for 2 blocks. She noticed the driver make a right turn, and the turn signal came on just a fraction late. That was all she needed. With a small smile, she flipped on her lights. The BMW pulled over smoothly into a safe spot, showing proper driving etiquette. Sarah touched her body camera to make sure it was recording, then stepped out of her patrol car. Her hand rested casually near her weapon, a habit she'd developed over the years, especially in what she considered uncertain situations. As she approached the driver's side window, she saw it rolling down smoothly. Behind the wheel sat a well-dressed black woman in her mid-40s, wearing a navy blue blazer and pearl earrings. Before Sarah could speak, the driver's calm voice asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" Sarah's response came out harder than necessary. License, registration, and insurance. Now, she emphasized the last word, watching the driver's reactions closely. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly at Sarah's tone, but she reached slowly for her purse. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, Officer Reynolds?" She had spotted Sarah's name tag. "Turn signal violation," Sarah said curtly. "You failed to signal within the required distance before your turn." "I see," the woman replied, her voice maintaining its professional calm. "I apologize if that's the case, though I'm quite certain I signaled properly." She handed over her documents, everything neat and organized. Sarah snatched the papers and stepped back to her patrol car, running the license through her system. The registration showed the car belonged to Diana Marshall. Everything was current and legal. This irritated Sarah more than she wanted to admit. Walking back to the BMW, Sarah noticed the woman was on her phone. "Put the phone down," she barked. "That's a secondary violation." "I'm sorry, officer," the woman said, lowering her phone, "but as a public servant, I have the right to." "Step out of the vehicle," Sarah interrupted, her hand now firmly on her weapon. "Now, Officer Reynolds," the woman spoke firmly but calmly, "I don't believe this situation requires." "I said step out." Sarah's voice rose. "Do not make me tell you again." Other cars were slowing down now, some people pulling out their phones to record. The woman carefully opened her door and stepped out, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She stood nearly as tall as Sarah in her modest heels. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Sarah ordered, pulling out her handcuffs. "Officer, this is completely unnecessary," the woman stated. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor." Sarah grabbed the woman's arm, spinning her around roughly. "You can talk to whoever you want down at the station. Right now, you're under arrest for resisting an officer and failure to comply with law enforcement commands." As Sarah cinched the handcuffs around the woman's wrists, she heard several car doors slam. 2 other patrol units had pulled up, responding to her earlier call for backup. "Sarah, what's going on here?" Officer Tom Martinez called out, jogging over. His eyes widened as he recognized the woman in handcuffs. But Sarah was already reciting the Miranda rights, drowning out her colleague's voice. She noticed people gathering on the sidewalk, phones raised, voices angry. She didn't care. She had made her decision, and she was going to stick to it. "Get in the car," she ordered, opening the back door of her patrol car. The woman ducked her head and entered without resistance, maintaining her dignity even in handcuffs. What Sarah didn't notice was Officer Martinez frantically making phone calls, or the growing crowd of onlookers, or the news van that had just pulled up at the corner. She was too focused on what she saw as a small victory in her day, completely unaware that she had just set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the entire Atlanta Police Department. The fluorescent lights at the Atlanta Police Department's central precinct buzzed overhead as Officer Sarah Reynolds marched her handcuffed suspect through the booking area. Other officers stopped their work to stare, some with confusion, others with growing concern on their faces. "Reynolds, my office. Now," the sharp voice of Captain James Baker cut through the station's usual noise. Sarah looked up to see her supervisor standing in his doorway, his face tight with worry. "Let me finish booking her first, sir," Sarah replied, pushing her arrestee toward the processing desk. "No," Captain Baker's voice was firm. "Martinez will handle that. My office, immediately." Sarah handed the paperwork to Officer Martinez, who avoided eye contact with her. She noticed he was sweating, which was odd for the air-conditioned building. As she walked toward the captain's office, she heard Martinez apologizing to the arrestee in a low voice. Inside the captain's office, Sarah found not only Baker but also Deputy Chief Wilson and the department's legal counsel, Linda Chen. Their faces looked like they were at a funeral. "Sit down, Reynolds," Baker said, pointing to a chair. "Do you have any idea who you just arrested?" Sarah shrugged. "Diana Marshall," refused to comply with. "State Senator Diana Marshall," Deputy Chief Wilson interrupted, his face reddening. "Chair of the Law Enforcement Oversight Committee, the same committee that controls our department's funding." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The room suddenly seemed much smaller. I didn't know." "Clearly," Linda Chen said, opening a laptop. "And now we have a bigger problem. Your body camera footage is already trending on social media." She turned the screen around. Sarah watched herself on the video, saw her aggressive stance, heard her harsh tone. In the harsh light of the precinct office, her actions looked very different from how she remembered them. 30,000 views in 20 minutes, Chen said quietly. "And climbing." Outside the office, they could hear a commotion growing. Through the blinds, Sarah saw news crews setting up their cameras in the station's lobby. Senator Marshall stood calmly talking to reporters, still wearing her handcuffs. "Get those cuffs off her immediately," Baker barked into his radio. Martinez rushed to comply, fumbling with the keys in his nervousness. "I was just following procedure," Sarah said weakly, but even she didn't believe her words anymore. "Really?" Chen picked up a file from the desk. "Like you followed procedure last month when you stopped 3 minority drivers in one shift, or last week when you conducted that questionable search?" Sarah felt her face growing hot. Those were legitimate stops. "Save it for internal affairs," Deputy Chief Wilson cut in. "They'll be here within the hour. We're looking at potential civil rights violations, abuse of power, and a PR nightmare that could set our community relations back 10 years. Through the office window, they watched as Senator Marshall, now free from the handcuffs, straightened her blazer. Instead of anger, her face showed determination. She was speaking to the reporters with the practiced ease of a seasoned politician. "This incident, while unfortunate, highlights the ongoing need for police reform and mandatory bias training," Senator Marshall's voice carried through the walls. "I am not interested in punitive measures against any individual officer. I am interested in systemic change." Sarah felt sick. The senator's composure made her own actions look even worse. Captain Baker's phone buzzed. He looked at it and sighed heavily. "The mayor's on his way, so is the NSSCP, and Reverend Jackson's people." "Reynolds," Deputy Chief Wilson said, "go to the conference room and wait for IA. Don't speak to anyone. Don't post anything on social media. Don't even think about deleting anything from your phone." As Sarah walked to the conference room, she passed the booking area where Senator Marshall was collecting her belongings. Their eyes met briefly. The senator's gaze wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was disappointed. "Officer Reynolds," the senator called out, making Sarah stop. "I hope this becomes a learning moment for everyone involved." Sarah wanted to respond, but no words came. She hurried to the conference room, closed the door, and sat alone in the silence. Through the window, she could see more news vans arriving, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like accusatory fingers. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow officers, but she didn't dare look at them. The morning's events played over and over in her mind. Each replay made her actions seem worse, her prejudices more obvious. As she waited for internal affairs, Sarah Reynolds realized that in trying to assert her authority over one traffic stop, She might have just destroyed everything she worked for. 3 days after the incident, Sarah Reynolds sat nervously in the sterile conference room of the Internal Affairs Division. The walls were an ugly shade of beige, and the clock's ticking seemed unusually loud. Across from her sat two EA investigators, Detective Marcus Rodriguez and Lieutenant Patricia Chen. "Let's go through your record, Officer Reynolds," Rodriguez said, opening a thick folder, papers spread across the table like a deck of cards. 6 years on the force, over 800 traffic stops. Notice anything interesting about these statistics? Sarah shifted in her chair. The numbers on the papers seemed to blur together. 78% of your stops involved minority drivers, Lieutenant Chen read from a document. That's significantly higher than your precinct's average. Care to explain? I stop people who break the law, Sarah said defensively. I don't look at color. Rodriguez pulled out more papers. Your partner, Officer James Wilson, had some interesting things to say. He adjusted his glasses. He claims you often made comments about certain neighborhoods, certain types of vehicles. Sarah's face grew hot. Jimmy had been her partner for 2 years. She trusted him. And here's something from Officer Martinez. Chen continued. He says you specifically watched that area where you stopped Senator Marshall because, in your words, expensive cars with tinted windows don't belong in that neighborhood. The air conditioning hummed loudly in the silence that followed. Sarah stared at her hands, remembering all the things she'd said, thinking they were just casual comments between colleagues. We've reviewed your body camera footage from the past 6 months, Rodriguez said, typing something on his laptop. Would you like to see some highlights? Without waiting for an answer, he turned the screen around. Sarah watched herself on multiple traffic stops. Each video showed the same pattern, her aggressive tone with minority drivers, her dismissive attitude, her quick escalation to threats of arrest. Stop, Sarah whispered. She couldn't watch anymore. Officer Reynolds. Chen leaned forward. Your union rep couldn't make it today, but you have the right to wait for them before continuing. No, Sarah said quietly. I want to keep going. A knock on the door interrupted them. A young officer entered with a stack of papers. Latest social media reports, he said, placing them on the table. Rodriguez flipped through them quickly. The video of Senator Marshall's arrest has over 2 million views now. Your name is trending on Twitter. Not in a good way. Sarah felt tears forming but fought them back. Cops didn't cry, especially not in front of IA. Your previous supervisors were interviewed, Chen said, pulling out more documents. Sergeant Peters from your rookie year noted concerns about your attitude toward minority communities. He recommended additional training. It never happened. Want to tell us why? Sarah remembered dodging those training sessions, always finding an excuse. She thought they were a waste of time. Your colleagues describe you as a good cop in many ways, Rodriguez added. Quick thinking, brave in dangerous situations, excellent at detective work. But they also say you have 2 different approaches to policing, one for white citizens and another for minorities. The truth of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd always justified her actions, told herself she was just being cautious, just following her instincts. The department is under intense pressure, Chen explained. Senator Marshall's incident has sparked protests. Civil rights groups are demanding action. They're reviewing every arrest you've made, every ticket you've written. Sarah thought about all those stops, all those faces looking at her with fear and resentment. She told herself it was just their guilty conscience. Now she wasn't so sure. We interviewed 30 people you've pulled over in the last month alone, Rodriguez continued. The stories are consistent and disturbing. He pushed a tissue box towards her. Sarah hadn't realized she was crying. Officer Reynolds. Chen's voice softened slightly. We're going to need your badge and gun while this investigation continues. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Sarah's hands shook as she removed her badge. It had been her pride for 6 years. Now it felt heavy with shame. The department psychologist is available, Rodriguez added. And you'll need to complete 40 hours of bias training before any consideration of reinstatement. As Sarah stood to leave, Chen spoke one last time. This isn't just about punishing you, Reynolds. It's about fixing a problem that goes deeper than one traffic stop. The question is, are you ready to admit there's a problem? Sarah walked out of the building, no longer an active police officer. Spring air felt different somehow. As she reached her car, she saw her reflection in the window. Just a woman now, no badge, no authority, forced to face the truth about herself. The hardest investigation, she realized, was just beginning. The evening news blared from Sarah Reynolds' TV as she sat alone in her dark living room. A week had passed since her suspension, but the story wouldn't die. On screen, hundreds of protesters gathered outside the Atlanta Police Department, their signs visible in the fading daylight. End police bias now. Justice for all. No more bad apples. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another message from her sister. Mom's worried. Please call. She ignored it, like she'd ignored the last 20 messages. The TV showed Senator Marshall speaking at a community meeting. This isn't about one officer, the senator was saying. This is about a system that needs change. When I was handcuffed that day, I wasn't thinking about my position as a state senator. I was thinking about every other person who has faced similar treatment without having my platform to speak up. Sarah took another sip of cold coffee, her 5th cup today. Her curtains stayed closed because reporters had camped outside her apartment building for 3 days. Some of her neighbors had stopped speaking to her. Mrs. Johnson from next door, who used to bring her cookies, now crossed the hallway when she saw Sarah coming. The TV switched to showing clips from her body camera footage again. Sarah watched herself on screen, saw her harsh treatment of the senator, heard her own angry voice. Social media had turned these clips into short videos, some set to music, others with added commentary. Her face was everywhere. Breaking news, the anchor announced. More footage has emerged from Officer Reynolds' past arrests. Warning. Some viewers may find these images disturbing. Sarah's stomach turned as more videos played. Each one showed her stopping people of color, her attitude aggressive, her words harsh. She hadn't seen herself this way before. Now she couldn't stop seeing it. Her doorbell rang, making her jump. Through the peephole, she saw Officer Martinez, holding a paper bag. "Go away, Tom," she called through the door. "You need to eat something," he replied, "and you need to know what's happening at the department." After a moment's hesitation, Sarah opened the door. Martinez looked tired, his uniform wrinkled. "They're reviewing everyone's arrest records now," he said, placing the bag of takeout on her kitchen counter. "The chief ordered bias training for the entire force. Some officers are angry about it. They're blaming you." "Great," Sarah muttered, but the smell of food made her realize she hadn't eaten all day. Martinez turned up the TV volume. Senator Marshall was speaking again, this time at a press conference outside the state capitol. "Tomorrow, I will introduce the Police Accountability and Reform Act," the senator announced. "This bill will mandate comprehensive bias training, require regular review of officer conduct, and establish an independent oversight committee." The crowd behind the senator cheered. Sarah saw familiar faces in the group, people she had stopped, searched, or arrested over the years. They were telling their stories now, and people were listening. "Your case is becoming a symbol," Martinez said quietly. "Both sides are using it. The reform groups want change. The police unions are fighting back. Nobody's asking what you think." Sarah laughed bitterly. "What I think doesn't matter anymore. I'm done. Nobody will ever trust me with a badge again." Her phone buzzed with a news alert. A local civil rights group had filed a class action lawsuit, demanding review of all arrests made by officers with high racial disparity in their stop records. Sarah's name headed the list. "The protesters aren't just outside the station anymore," Martinez continued. "They're organizing marches through the neighborhoods where you made most of your stops. People are sharing their stories. It's like a dam broke." On TV, they showed aerial footage of the protests. The crowds grew larger each day. Sarah recognized the streets where she used to patrol, now filled with people demanding change. "Some good might come from this," Martinez said, opening the takeout containers. "Maybe we all needed a wake-up call." Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the department psychologist, reminding her of tomorrow's mandatory session. Below that was a message about her bias training schedule, starting next week. Outside, she heard chanting from a passing group of protesters. Their voices carried clearly through her closed windows. "No justice, no peace." "You can't hide in here forever," Martinez said, handing her a plastic fork. "At some point, you'll You'll have to face what's happening. Sarah finally took a bite of food, her first real meal in days. On TV, the protesters continued their march, their signs illuminated by streetlights. One caught her eye. Change starts with understanding. As she watched the peaceful but determined crowd, Sarah realized that maybe they weren't just protesting against her, they were demanding something better from everyone who wore the badge she'd lost. Dr. Monica West's office felt too comfortable for Sarah Reynolds' liking. The soft couch, gentle lighting, and calming paintings on the walls seemed to mock her inner turmoil. It was her fourth therapy session of the week, part of her mandatory counseling during administrative leave. "Tell me about your father," Dr. West said, her notepad balanced on her knee. "You mentioned he was also a police officer." Sarah stared out the window. Rain tapped against the glass, matching her gloomy mood. "Dad worked the tough neighborhoods in Chicago for 20 years. He taught me everything about being a cop." "What did he teach you about different communities?" Sarah's mind drifted to Sunday dinners from her childhood. Her father's voice, loud and confident, telling stories about his patrols. "He said you had to be tough, that certain neighborhoods were trouble. Certain people were always up to no good. And you believed him?" "He was my hero," Sarah whispered. "Everything I knew about policing came from him." Dr. West leaned forward. "Sarah, do you remember our first session? You couldn't even admit there was a problem with your actions. Now you're starting to see patterns. That's progress." The rain grew heavier outside. Sarah thought about her partner, Officer Marcus Johnson, a black officer she'd worked with for 2 years. He had tried to talk to her many times about her attitude, but she'd always brushed him off. "I got a letter from Marcus yesterday," Sarah said. "He wrote about what it felt like watching my body camera videos, how it hurt him to see how differently I treated people based on their race. He said he kept quiet too long." "How did that letter make you feel?" Sarah felt tears forming. Ashamed. Angry at myself. Marcus was my friend, and I never really listened to him. I didn't want to hear it. Dr. West handed her a tissue. "Yesterday, you attended your first bias training session. How was that?" Sarah remembered sitting in the back of the room, trying to make herself invisible, but then something unexpected happened. The trainer was this retired black officer from Boston, Sarah explained. He talked about his own struggles with bias, how he had to unlearn things he'd been taught. It wasn't just about pointing fingers. It was about understanding ourselves. "Did anything specific stand out to you?" Sarah nodded. "We watched videos of traffic stops. Some were like mine, aggressive, confrontational. Others showed different approaches, respectful, professional. The same situations, but such different outcomes." She paused, remembering one particular exercise. They had us role-play traffic stops. I had to play the driver while another officer played the aggressive cop. It was eye-opening. "How so?" "I felt scared, humiliated. Even though it wasn't real, my heart was racing. And I realized that's how I made people feel. Every day, for years." Dr. West wrote something in her notepad. "You've been reading the letters from community members." It was part of Sarah's rehabilitation program, reading letters from people she'd stopped or arrested. Some were angry, others sad. All of them described how their encounters with her had affected their lives. "There was this one letter," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "A mother wrote about her teenage son. I stopped him last year, made him lie on the ground because I thought his cell phone was a weapon. She said he's still afraid to drive at night." The rain had stopped now. Sunlight tried to break through the clouds. "My dad visited last weekend," Sarah continued. "First time since this all happened. He started talking about the good old days of policing, defending my actions. But for the first time, I stood up to him. Told him he was wrong. That we were both wrong." "How did he react?" "He left angry. We haven't spoken since." Sarah managed a small smile, but it felt good to say it out loud. Dr. West closed her notepad. "Sarah, recognizing our biases is painful. It means admitting that our heroes, even our parents, might have taught us the wrong things. It means facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves." Sarah stood up, walking to the window. Outside, life went on. People rushing to work, kids heading to school, all those lives she used to impact with her badge and her biases. "I can't change what I did," she said quietly, "but I can change who I become. That's why we're here, Dr. West replied, "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. One honest conversation at a time." As Sarah left the office, she checked her phone. A notification showed another bias training session tomorrow. Instead of dread, she felt something new, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be better. The state capitol building buzzed with activity as Sarah Reynolds walked through the security checkpoint. 2 months had passed since the incident. Her hands trembled as she handed over her visitor's badge to the guard, who did a double take when he read her name. "Committee Room 204, he said, pointing down the marble hallway. Sarah's footsteps echoed as she walked. Today, Senator Marshall's police reform bill would have its first public hearing. Sarah hadn't planned to come, but last night she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would testify. Outside room 204, reporters clustered with their cameras and microphones. They spotted her immediately. "Officer Reynolds, are you here to oppose the bill? Do you regret your actions? Have you spoken to Senator Marshall?" Sarah pushed past them without answering. Inside the room, every seat was taken. Civil rights leaders sat in the front row. Police union representatives occupied another section. In the middle, regular citizens waited to share their stories. Senator Marshall stood at the podium, her voice firm and clear. "This bill isn't about punishment. It's about progress. We need to change how we think about policing in our communities." Sarah found a spot against the back wall, trying to stay invisible. But invisibility wasn't her goal today. She had signed up to speak, and her name would be called. "The bill requires 200 hours of bias training for all officers," Senator Marshall continued. "It mandates body cameras, regular performance reviews, and community oversight boards." Some police officers in the crowd shook their heads. Sarah recognized them from her precinct. They hadn't spoken to her since that day. "Next speaker," the committee chairman announced, "Sarah Reynolds." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to watch as Sarah walked to the podium. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself forward. Senator Marshall's face showed surprise, but she gave a small, encouraging nod. Sarah pulled out her prepared notes, then set them aside. She needed to speak from her heart. "My name is Sarah Reynolds," she began, her voice shaky. 2 months ago, I wrongfully arrested Senator Marshall. But that wasn't my only mistake. It was just the one that finally got attention." She gripped the podium tighter. "I've spent the last 2 months in therapy and bias training. I've read hundreds of letters from people I stopped or arrested, people whose lives I affected because of my prejudices." The room remained silent, everyone listening. "I used to think good policing meant being tough," Sarah continued. "My father was a cop. He taught me to see threats everywhere, especially in minority communities. I carried those biases with me every day I wore the badge." She saw some of her former colleagues shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "The training this bill requires, I've been through it now. It's not about making officers feel guilty. It's about understanding our biases and learning to be better. It's hard work. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary." Sarah looked directly at Senator Marshall. "I'm not here asking for my job back. I'm here because this bill might prevent other officers from making the same mistakes I did. It might help them recognize their biases before they hurt people." Her voice grew stronger. "Some officers here today will say this bill is anti-police. They're wrong. It's pro-community. It's pro-justice. And yes, it's pro-police because it helps us become the officers we're supposed to be." Tears formed in her eyes, but she continued. "I arrested Senator Marshall because of the color of her skin. I can admit that now, but she could have demanded my firing. Instead, she wrote this bill to help create change. That's real leadership." The room remained silent when she finished. Then, slowly, people began to applaud. Not everyone. Some officers still sat with crossed arms, but enough to fill the room with sound. As Sarah walked back to her spot, she passed Senator Marshall, who reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. No words were needed. Later, outside the Capitol, reporters surrounded her again. This time, Sarah stopped to answer their questions. She spoke about her journey, her learning, her hope for change. As cameras flashed around her, she realized that sometimes the biggest impact comes not from wearing a badge, but from admitting you wore it wrong. That evening, the committee voted to move the bill forward. Sarah watched the news coverage from home. feeling both proud and humbled. Her testimony had helped open a door for change. Now it was up to others to walk through it. 3 months after her testimony at the state capitol, Sarah Reynolds sat in a small coffee shop downtown, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of green tea. The shop was Senator Marshall's choice for their first real meeting, away from cameras and committees. The bell above the door chimed. Senator Marshall walked in, dressed casually in jeans and a blazer, looking more like a regular person than a powerful politician. She ordered her coffee and joined Sarah at the corner table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying 3 months of therapy and self-reflection. "Your testimony helped pass the bill," Senator Marshall replied, stirring her coffee. "That took courage. That's not why we're here today, is it?" Sarah shook her head. She practiced this moment countless times in her mind, but now the carefully prepared words felt inadequate. "I owe you a real apology," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. "Not a public one for the cameras. Not one written by my lawyer. Just the truth." Through the coffee shop window, life went on as usual. People hurried past, some laughing, others focused on their phones. Sarah wondered how many of them had seen her body camera footage, had judged her actions that day. That morning, Sarah continued, "I saw a black woman in an expensive car and made assumptions. Assumptions I'd been making my whole career. Assumptions my father taught me to make." Senator Marshall listened quietly, her face showing no judgment. "In therapy, they made us dig deep into our pasts," Sarah said. "I remembered my first day at school in Chicago. There was this black girl, Michelle, who tried to be my friend. My dad told me not to play with her. Said her family was trouble. I was 7 years old." Sarah wiped away a tear. "I carried those prejudices with me. Through school, through the police academy, onto the streets. I never questioned them, never wanted to question them." A barista dropped a cup nearby, making them both jump. The sudden noise broke the tension, and Senator Marshall smiled slightly. "You know what I remember most about that day?" the senator asked. "Not the handcuffs, not your harsh words. I remember thinking, she's scared. Under all that aggression, you were scared." Sarah hadn't expected this observation. Scared. Scared of losing control. Scared of being wrong about your assumptions. Scared of questioning everything you've been taught to believe. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd never thought about it that way. "The training program you helped create," Sarah said, changing the subject slightly, "is making a difference. I visit the academy sometimes, share my story with new recruits. Some listen, some don't, but at least they're hearing it." Senator Marshall nodded. "Change happens slowly, person by person, story by story. My father finally watched the body camera footage last week," Sarah shared. "He called me afterward, crying. Said he was sorry for teaching me the wrong things. We're both in therapy now, trying to understand why we believed what we believed." Outside, a police car cruised past the coffee shop. Both women watched it pass. "I missed the job," Sarah admitted. "Not the person I was in the job, but the idea of helping people. Really helping them, not just enforcing rules based on prejudice." "Have you thought about what's next?" Senator Marshall asked. Sarah pulled out a folded paper from her purse. "I've been accepted into a social work program, focusing on community relations and racial justice. It feels right." "Good," Senator Marshall smiled. "We need people who understand both sides of this issue, people who've learned from their mistakes." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the afternoon light play through the coffee shop windows. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said finally. "Why did you agree to meet me today?" Senator Marshall considered the question. "Because healing happens face to face. Because change requires both accountability and forgiveness. And because sometimes the people who've made the biggest mistakes become the strongest advocates for change." As they finished their drinks, Senator Marshall reached into her bag and pulled out a small book. "It's about unconscious bias. I think you're ready for it now." Sarah took the book, noticing the senator's personal notes in the margins. This wasn't just a peace offering, it was an invitation to keep learning, keep growing. When they left the coffee shop, they didn't hug or make dramatic gestures. They simply shook hands, two women acknowledging their roles in a story that was bigger than both of them. "Keep doing the work," Senator Marshall said simply. "I will," Sarah promised. And for the first time in months, she felt truly worthy of being believed. 1 year after the traffic stop that changed everything, Sarah Reynolds stood at the front of a packed classroom at the Atlanta Police Academy. The faces of 30 new police recruits looked back at her, some curious, others skeptical. They all knew who she was. Her story had become required learning in police training across the state. My badge number was 2749, Sarah began, her voice steady now after countless similar presentations. For 6 years, I thought I was a good cop. Today, I'm here to tell you why I was wrong. At the back of the room, Senator Marshall slipped in quietly. They'd often worked together now, but today she was just here to watch. Their unlikely partnership had become a powerful symbol of change. Last week, I completed my social work degree, Sarah continued, clicking to show her body camera footage on the screen. Some recruits shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This video isn't easy to watch, but it's important that you see it. The room fell silent as they watched the footage of Senator Marshall's arrest. Sarah noticed one young black female recruit wipe away a tear. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty," Sarah said after the video ended. "I'm here to help you recognize what I couldn't see back then, how bias affects every decision we make on the street." She walked among the desks, making eye contact with each recruit. "You've all been through the new training program. 200 hours of bias awareness, community relations, de-escalation techniques. Some of you probably thought it was overkill." A few recruits nodded hesitantly. "Let me tell you what I learned in the year since that traffic stop," Sarah continued. "I learned that good policing isn't about power. It's about service. It's not about fear. It's about understanding." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the department's new community oversight program: complaints down by 40%, use of force incidents reduced by half. "These numbers represent real people," Sarah explained, "real lives. Every time you put on that uniform, you're not just enforcing laws. You're building, or breaking, trust." Officer Martinez, now a sergeant, entered the room carrying a box. Sarah smiled at him before turning back to the class. "In this box are letters," she said as Martinez set it down. "Letters from people I wrongfully stopped or arrested during my time as an officer. I've read each one dozens of times. They're part of your required reading now." She pulled out one letter. "This one's from a teenager I handcuffed because he looked suspicious walking home from basketball practice. He's in college now, studying criminal justice. Says he wants to change the system from within." The recruits passed the letters around, reading quietly. "Your training includes something mine never did," Sarah continued. "Regular meetings with community members. Not as suspects or witnesses, but as partners. You'll hear their stories, understand their fears, learn their perspectives." Senator Marshall moved to the front of the room. "Officer Reynolds, Sarah, is now head of our department's community relations unit. She works with both officers and citizens to build bridges that should have been built long ago." Sarah nodded gratefully. "Every month, I meet with new officers struggling with their own biases. I share my story, but more importantly, I listen to theirs. Change doesn't happen through shame. It happens through understanding." She clicked to her final slide, a photo of herself with a group of community leaders, including Senator Marshall, at the opening of the new Police Community Partnership Center. "Next week, you'll graduate," Sarah said. "You'll get your badges and your assignments. You'll feel powerful. But remember this: true power isn't in your weapon or your badge. It's in your ability to serve everyone in your community with equal respect and dignity." After the presentation, recruits lined up to talk with her. Some shared their own stories of bias, others asked for advice. Sarah listened to each one, remembering her own journey. Later, as she packed up her materials, Senator Marshall approached. "They listened to you," the senator said, "because you're living proof that people can change." Sarah looked at her watch. She had another meeting soon, with a support group for officers dealing with racial bias. Then community outreach planning, followed by dinner with her father, who was now actively involved in police reform efforts. "A year ago, I lost my badge," Sarah said, gathering her things. "But I found my purpose." As they walked out of the academy together, new recruits were practicing traffic stops in the training yard. Sarah watched them carefully following the new protocols, respectful, professional, aware of their own biases. One class at a time, Senator Marshall said softly, One change at a time, Sarah agreed. And for the first time since that fateful traffic stop, Sarah felt complete peace about her new path. She hadn't just learned from her mistakes, she'd helped create real change. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest victories come after the hardest falls.